He was born in 1908 in Greenbrier County, West Virginia, in a place where survival was not a phase of life but its permanent condition. The land did not forgive mistakes. The soil was thin, the terrain uneven, and the weather relentless. Winters arrived early and stayed too long. Summers pressed down with heavy humidity that made even standing still feel like labor. Life there demanded endurance before it offered anything else. The Harris family lived in a structure that barely qualified as a house. It had been assembled over years, piece by piece, whenever materials became available or were salvaged from elsewhere. There was no foundation beneath it, only hard-packed earth that turned to mud when it rained and dust when it didn't. The walls did not keep the cold out, they only slowed it down. Elijah learned early that comfort was not something expected or requested. It was something other families had. Inside the house, everything was measured: food portions, firewood, even speech. Complaints were useless. They changed nothing and invited attention the family could not afford. Silence was safer. Silence cost nothing. It was in that silence that Elijah began to observe more than he spoke, learning how restraint preserved survival. His father worked whenever his body allowed it: timber hauling, repairs, seasonal labor. The pay was inconsistent and often delayed. Years of dust and damp air weakened him until his coughing became constant. When his father died, there was no time for grief. The death changed nothing except the math. One less body, one less income. The debt remained exactly where it was. Elijah's mother did not speak about loss. She reorganized life around it, cleaning warm houses that never belonged to her, washing clothes for people who avoided her eyes, standing for hours so her hands could earn money that never touched anything new. By the age of 10, Elijah learned that poverty was not only lack, it was position. He saw it everywhere, in how shopkeepers looked at him before he spoke, in how landowners were offered credit while families like his paid up front or went without. Names softened conversations. Ownership changed tone. Power created patience. Elijah did not resent this openly. Resentment wasted energy. Instead, he cataloged it, memorizing who owned land, who controlled work, and who was corrected harshly. Elijah spoke rarely. Listening provided more information. At 14, he left school without argument. School offered theory. Work offered leverage. Farms, clearing crews, construction when it existed. He slept where permitted, ate sparingly, saved everything he could. Hunger became familiar, something to manage rather than fear. During these years, he learned discipline in its purest form: how much discomfort a body could tolerate, how long silence could be maintained. He watched other men closely. Those who drank lost money. Those who complained were ignored. Those who planned survived longer. When the Great Depression arrived, it did not shock him. For families like his, the margin had always been thin. Land became cheap. Desperation became visible. Elijah waited. He understood land did not lose value permanently, only temporarily. He bought small, unwanted parcels others could no longer afford. He did not improve them. He did not advertise them. He held them. This patience separated him from the people he grew up beside. While others reacted emotionally, Elijah reacted structurally. He positioned himself so opportunity would arrive. By the early 1940s, demand returned through war production. Roads expanded. Timber moved again. Elijah sold land carefully and reinvested into larger holdings, quiet systems, reliable systems. By the end of the war, Elijah Harris was no longer defined by survival. He was defined by accumulation. Money changed posture. Men who once ignored him now waited on his decisions. Employers became partners. Partners became dependent. Marriage followed. Pragmatic, stable, useful. From the outside, Elijah appeared disciplined, cautious, unbreakable. Inside, something new had begun to form, quietly, invisibly, without warning. As Elijah Harris moved into his late 30s and early 40s, the distinction between necessity and ambition began to disappear. Survival had long since been secured. What remained was expansion. He no longer measured success by stability, but by comparison. Who owned more land? Who controlled more contracts? Whose name carried further when spoken quietly in the right rooms? The region was changing, and Elijah changed with it. He invested in infrastructure before others understood its value. Storage facilities near transport routes, equipment enabling faster turnaround, agreements that tied local businesses to his operation without visibility. He disliked attention. Visibility invited scrutiny, and scrutiny introduced variables he could not always control. By the late 1940s, the Harris name carried expectation rather than admiration. Decisions were made with Elijah's position in mind, even when he was absent. This influence had not been granted. It accumulated slowly, transaction by transaction, favor by favor, obligation by obligation. Quietly, without ceremony, his household reflected that consolidation of power. The home he shared with his wife was solid but restrained, not extravagant. Excess invited questions. Everything was chosen to signal competence rather than wealth, warmth without luxury, security without display. Inside those walls, order was absolute and unquestioned. Meals followed schedule. Accounts were reviewed privately. Visitors were limited and purposeful. Elijah never raised his voice. Silence followed him naturally. Children were raised with structure, not tenderness. Weakness, he believed, was a liability. Discipline had saved him from erasure, and he demanded it without apology. As years passed, Elijah's control deepened. He understood leverage precisely. Which officials relied on which revenues, which families depended on which wages. Influence did not require visibility, it required placement. It was during this period of stability that gambling returned quietly into his life. The first games felt harmless, extensions of negotiation, rooms where information moved freely, and outcomes felt guided by observation rather than luck. Elijah watched patterns, calculated probabilities, controlled emotion. Early success followed him just enough to reinforce confidence, just enough to justify repetition. He convinced himself the games were harmless. Recreation, networking, release. Gambling appealed not because of thrill, but because it mirrored his belief that patience and discipline could influence any system. Control, once learned, felt transferable. That belief made him stay. As business stabilized, stakes increased subtly. Larger bets signaled seriousness. Seriousness commanded respect. Elijah refused retreat. Retreat suggested uncertainty. Losses were dismissed as fluctuations, statistical noise, temporary misalignment. He believed correction was inevitable, not optional. By the early 1950s, the games grew more private and frequent. Stakes rose, not for pleasure, but for resolution. Each loss created urgency to restore balance. He told himself he was different, methodical, controlled. He gambled not from impulse, but from excessive trust in discipline. At home, changes appeared quietly. Longer absences, irritation during account reviews. His wife noticed discrepancies but avoided confrontation. Order mattered more than explanations. The children felt tension before it was spoken. Silence lengthened. Routine hardened. Elijah's presence no longer stabilized the room. Money moved without documentation. Properties were leveraged without discussion. Each decision was framed as strategy. Questioning implied ignorance Elijah would not tolerate. Rumors surfaced quietly. A bad game, a dispute resolved privately, nothing concrete. Reputation absorbed uncertainty easily. Elijah noticed the shift, but dismissed it. He believed collapse happened to men without patience. What he failed to see was the contradiction at the core of his control. Discipline had convinced him that chance could be subordinated permanently, that systems never reasserted themselves. By the early 1960s, the structure he built was under strain, not publicly, internally. Margins vanished. Each correction demanded flawless timing. Timing no longer belonged to him. He did not reduce risk, he concentrated it. Because control, once threatened, does not release easily. As the pressure increased, Elijah Harris did not slow down. Slowing down would have meant accepting limits, and limits were something he had spent his life proving could be overcome. Instead, he refined routines and compartmentalized everything. Business by day, private obligations by night. Separation, he believed, would preserve control. The games became fewer and narrower, no longer social, no longer casual. They were arranged deliberately in quiet rooms with people who understood discretion. Stakes increased not from vanity, but from urgency. Higher stakes offered faster correction. Time had become the enemy, and speed felt necessary. Elijah kept careful records, but never written. Paper could be discovered. Memory could not. He tracked who owed him, who he owed, which promises were permanent and which were temporary. In his mind, obligations existed in layers, all awaiting a final balance he believed he could still restore. At home, routines hardened further. Meals happened precisely on time. Doors closed more often. Conversation narrowed to necessity. His wife adapted without confrontation, interpreting silence as strategy rather than warning. Order still appeared intact, and as long as order existed, she believed control remained possible. The children sensed strain more clearly. Their father's presence grew heavier and less predictable. Praise disappeared. Correction arrived quickly and without explanation. Discipline replaced guidance. Elijah believed pressure created resilience. He could not see it was eroding trust more efficiently than weakness ever could. Financial maneuvers accelerated quietly. Properties were pledged temporarily, he told himself. Credit lines extended informally. Income was rerouted with the intent of rapid replacement. Each move was framed as a bridge to stability, even as those bridges were being built over air. He justified behavior by recalling earlier victories. He had leveraged risk before. He had waited while others panicked. The difference now was subtle but fatal. He was no longer waiting. He was pursuing. Patience had transformed into urgency without him noticing the moment it changed. The emotional texture of gambling shifted. Early wins brought satisfaction. Losses now produced irritation, then fixation. He replayed hands endlessly, not emotionally, but analytically. Randomness was unacceptable. Randomness threatened identity, and identity was something he defended aggressively. Elijah believed the correct sequence of actions would restore order. That discipline, sustained long enough, would force the system to realign. This belief insulated him from doubt but isolated him from reality. Confidence replaced assessment. Commitment replaced caution. People around him adapted quietly. Associates offered distance rather than confrontation. Creditors trusted his name but monitored outcomes closely. Those who noticed irregularities chose discretion. Silence was still beneficial. For now, it outweighed the cost of truth. Elijah sensed narrowing tolerance, but misread it. He saw impatience in others, not instability in himself. He believed confidence would return once outcomes improved. He never considered that patience, even when bought by reputation, was finite. Sleep became irregular. He stayed awake reviewing possibilities, then rose early to maintain appearances. Exhaustion sharpened focus but dulled judgment. He relied more on instinct, convinced it had never failed him. Instinct falters when probability shifts. By the early 1960s, the system required constant reinforcement. Momentum replaced margin. Each loss demanded immediate response. Decisions compressed into narrow windows. Speed felt like control. Delay felt like surrender. Concentration replaced reflection. At the table, bets increased out of necessity rather than strategy. Losses became unacceptable psychologically. Accepting them meant confronting limits. Behind the scenes, debts multiplied slowly, each manageable alone. Together, they depended entirely on future correction. Only belief remained. Confrontation finally surfaced at home, not as accusation but concern. Elijah explained selectively, offering partial truths. Transparency without certainty, he believed, created panic. Panic disrupted control. Control was still possible, he insisted, just not yet. The family sensed the pattern, even if they could not trace it. The man who once planned ahead now reacted sharply to disruption. Tolerance vanished. Everything became urgent. Everything required immediate alignment. Trust thinned quietly. Elijah felt no guilt. Guilt implied moral failure. He felt frustration. Frustration implied mechanical error. Errors could be fixed. He believed that still, The night that ended everything arrived quietly. Familiar setting, familiar faces, expectations built on reputation rather than assessment. Elijah entered, convinced this sequence would restore order. It did not. Loss followed loss without pause. Correction through escalation felt necessary. Backing down would have crystallized failure. By the time the final decision was made, adjustment was no longer possible. By morning, the structure collapsed. Afterward, there were no raised voices, only documentation. Agreements executed under pressure, assets pledged, obligations formalized without reversal. The correction he chased for years arrived, but in a form he could not control. Elijah returned home without explanation because none preserved authority. Silence became the final strategy. What followed was management, not mourning. Sales arranged discreetly. Debts addressed gradually. Records adjusted. The name preserved. Elijah remained, but as symbol rather than force. Presence without influence. Memory without momentum. The belief that carried him out of poverty lingered, stripped of effectiveness. Control had lifted him once. It had also blinded him. The morning after the collapse did not look different from any other. The same light entered the rooms. The same sounds moved across the land. No alarms were triggered. No authorities arrived. Nothing external acknowledged what had happened overnight. To the outside world, the system still existed exactly as it always had. Inside the household, however, the shift was immediate. There were no arguments and no open confrontations. The family avoided questions that demanded answers. Instinctively, they understood that answers would deepen the damage. What mattered now was containment, not explanation, and preservation rather than confrontation. Elijah Harris understood this instinctively. He did not justify his decisions. Justification implied debate. Debate implied resistance. He offered neither explanation nor apology. Silence became the only currency he still possessed. In silence, authority could survive, even when power could not. Assets were addressed with precision. Properties were measured not by sentiment, but by how quickly they could be converted without attention. Transactions were staggered. Intermediaries chosen carefully. Records adjusted just enough to remain coherent. This was not theatrical deception. It was administrative survival. Elijah's role diminished rapidly. Decisions were made around him rather than through him. Meetings no longer required his presence. Conversations continued after he left the room. He noticed the shift, but did not resist it. Resistance would have required belief in recovery. That belief no longer existed. In public, he remained composed. He attended obligations when expected and spoke only when addressed. His posture still carried traces of past influence, and people responded out of habit. Habit lingers longer than reality, often well after circumstances have fundamentally changed. Privately, Elijah retreated into recollection. He replayed events, not with regret, but with calculation. He searched for the precise moment where restraint might have preserved balance. He never considered that the process itself had become irreversible long before that night arrived. The years that followed were quiet. Purpose eroded. The structure that once defined his days dissolved. Time expanded. Hours passed slowly, without decisions to make. He did not replace gambling with another pursuit. The impulse remained, but without outlet, it turned inward. Elijah did not seek forgiveness. Forgiveness implied moral resolution. He believed the failure had been technical, not ethical. This belief isolated him completely, leaving no room for reconciliation. Only distance remained between him and those who had once relied on his authority. When Elijah Harris died, there was no reckoning. The family chose something modest and restrained. Attendance followed expectation. Words were selected carefully. Achievements were mentioned without detail. Losses were omitted. The past remained arranged, undisturbed by inquiry. After his death, protection dissolved slowly, not through intention, but absence. No one remained who understood which silences mattered. Documents were archived without context. Records accessed for unrelated reasons. Numbers compared accidentally, without awareness of what they completed. What emerged was not scandal, but clarity. Patterns instead of accusations. Timelines instead of confessions. The collapse of Elijah Harris's empire traced back not to one decision, but to a sustained belief that control could permanently override uncertainty. No one benefited from this understanding. It restored nothing. It punished no one. It changed no outcomes. It simply completed the record. The region continued changing, indifferent to legacy. New systems replaced old ones. Names lost meaning over time. The Harris name remained, but thinned with each generation. Without knowing the cost that built it, the name became decoration. What remains now is not a lesson offered willingly, but one left unintentionally. Discipline hardened into certainty. Certainty blinded. Elijah Harris escaped poverty through patience, calculation, and restraint. He lost everything through the belief that those same qualities would always protect him. They did not. Time passed, silence held, and control surrendered to the only force it could not negotiate with: time. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story all the way through. Some stories are not meant to provide answers, only witnesses. If this one stayed with you after the final words, then it was told as it should be. This chapter ends here, but not every story truly ends. Follow the channel for future stories. We will meet again soon.